Okay, so President Trump put all these tariffs on. He doesn't have the authority under the Constitution to put a single tariff on a single thing, right? So how did he do it? Well, the answer is that in 1962, Congress passed a law that lowered tariffs. Congress went out and lowered tariffs way down. It's part of this General Agreement, Tariffs and Trade, that we'll talk about in a minute. But in this law is Section 232. And Section 232 of this 1962 law says the president can place tariffs on goods if necessary for national security, and define that as making sure that resources that are essential for the military are available inside the United States. So if you're President Trump, you argue that U.S. steel manufacturing is going away, and we need to protect U.S. steel manufacturing so that the military can get their hands on steel when they need to get their hands on steel. So the Trump administration used that to put tariffs on China and Mexico and the European Union and Canada. We should note that the USMCA specifically prevents Section 232 from being applied in the future to autos from Canada and Mexico. So Canada and Mexico have tried to get us essentially to change the law, change this section 232 of this 1962 law, because they're more than a tad upset that they're being deemed national security risks, that Mexico and Canada are a national security risk. And anyway. Basically, the tariffs that were used to 232 are mostly on steel and aluminum imports. Other stuff, we get most of our steel and aluminum from Canada, Korea, and Brazil. We didn't really do anything to Brazil, but Canada and Korea. We did stuff, and we renegotiated some things with Korea, and they're not part of this for the most part anymore. We're being mean to Canada, mean to Mexico, mean to China, and we deal with Europe. We put car tariffs on, and President Trump has specifically gone after the German car industry. When there's one very interesting fact that balances out of this, and this is why these things are so complex. What's the right answer? I don't know. What's the way to do these things? I don't know. And it's not clear that anybody really knows. The largest exporter of U.S.-made cars is BMW. BMW exports more vehicles from the United States than any other car company. So they import cars, they export cars, they employ 10,000 people in South Carolina. I don't know. It makes our world so complex that these companies are bringing cars in from outside the United States. At the same time, they're making cars inside the United States. They're employing U.S. workers. They're using steel from other countries, which is hurting you. These are complex issues. President Bush, a long time ago, put a tariff on steel imported from Brazil. And the first people to complain weren't the Brazilian steel companies. The first people to complain were General Motors and Ford. These things are so complex. Okay? GM has estimated that the tariffs have cost them $1 billion so far. Beer producers estimate they've cost $347 million because I'm sure none of you drink, but if you do, beer comes in cans that are made out of aluminum. Farm income in 2018 fell by 22% compared to 2017, and Congress spent $12 billion bailing out farmers so they wouldn't go bankrupt. China went from being the largest U.S. customer for soybeans to buying no soybeans. So President Trump says trade wars are good and easy to win. It depends on whose perspective we're taking. So right now, Americans, and you're going to do some reading on this, American industries are taking a lot of hits because when you do something, the other country to China, China does something back to you. And it hurts both sides until you can negotiate something, hopefully, to get out of it. I don't know. These things are so complex again. But the economics tells us that almost always when there's a trade war where people are slapping tariffs on each other, both sides end up losing. That's the history of these things. Is you go back and we'll talk about the 1930s in a minute. 1930s big tariff war. Everybody who did it got hurt. The United States, early in its history, took advantage of the fact that England and France were blocking trade between each other, and the United States had hundreds of ships that basically were never in the United States. They were moving stuff between England and France. So if you're not allowed, if England and France are set up so that there's all these taxes and tariffs and they're not allowed to trade, you go to England, you buy a bunch of stuff, you take it offshore, you slip stickers on it so it looks like it came from the United States, and you go sell it in France without a tax. And then you buy a bunch of French wine, and you stick stuff on it so it looks like it's American, and then you go back over to England, and you sell it to the British without a tax. And U.S. companies, U.S. sailors were making a whole lot of money by exploiting these trade wars that were going on between other countries. The trade wars were never, it's hard to find an example of a trade war that ended up helping one country and hurting the other. They seem to always hurt both sides. Okay, so here's some stuff from the Farm Bureau, some people who are big supporters, obviously, of farmers. And what we see is that we export and import a lot of beef. The U.S. charges its non-FTA partners, which means the people who aren't in those trade agreements, an average of about 12% tariff on beef. China's average tariff on beef is about 14%, so their tariff is was about what ours was, but now tariff on U.S. beef is between 37 and 50%. So they took a 14% tariff and they raised it, or 12 to 20% tariff, and they made it 37 to 50. And obviously that's going to slow down exports of U.S. beef to China. The U.S., due to NAFTA, there's no tariff on beef exports to and from Canada and Mexico. There would be a tariff if there wasn't. You should know that McDonald's says not that they have U.S. beef in their burgers, that they have North American beef, and that means most of their beef is coming from Canada and Mexico. So your Big Mac is cheaper because of NAFTA. And Japan has a 38.5% tariff on beef. If we had joined TPP, that would now be a 0% tariff on beef. So Japan is the largest customer of U.S. beef, even with that big tariff, and we would have gotten rid of it under TPP and probably sold a lot more beef to Japan. And you note that Korea has a 40% beef tariff, but we don't have to pay that tariff because we have a treaty. And actually we pay 21%, but that's still half of what the tariff would be without the treaty. So again, corn, free trade partners, we sell them billions of dollars of corn every year, no tariffs. China has a 1% tariff on a certain quantity and then 65% above that, or had. Now, because they're mad at us, there's a 26% tariff on what the 1%, what used to be charged a 1% tax, now it's charged a 26% tax, and the part that used to be charged 65% is now charged 90% tax. We have obviously NAFTA is part of a free trade agreement, there's zero tariffs. The export of corn would have a 4% tax if it wasn't there. Japan's tariff on corn is 0. Korea's tariff on corn is 0. But if we didn't have that agreement with Korea, our tax would be 428% on corn. So the Farm Bureau is trying to make this argument that these agreements are good to us. Farmers are getting to export goods without taxes because of these agreements, and now that there's this retaliation going on with China, these taxes are much higher than they would have been, and that's getting in the way of us selling goods to other countries. So again, we don't know how this is all going to work out. As I'm speaking on this, there could be some beautiful deal that's negotiated that makes everybody happy, and we'll see. But meanwhile, there's been billions and billions of dollars of losses to car companies and farmers all across the United States and in China. Okay, so this is just a little picture of who the big exporters in the world are. China is the #1 exporter. The United States is the second biggest exporter. Germany's third. And then you can see that there's a whole bunch of countries in the $400, $500, $600 billion range. But China, US, Germany, way bigger exporters basically than every other country in the world. Tariff history in the United States. Let's go back and remember that the United States federal government before the 1900s didn't have a lot of options. So their taxes system was basically excise taxes and tariffs. So tariffs have to be high enough that you collect money, not so high that they stop trade, but high enough that you collect money. So tariffs go up and down. We have this thing called the Tariff Abominations in 1828. That's Andrew Jackson trying to force southern states to sell their cotton to the north, and so they put a huge tariff on cotton, which means that it's hard for, not on cotton, but on cloth. So the British have trouble importing cloth in the United States, and the Southerners are all mad at us. Southern people are all mad at the Northern people because they don't want to sell their cotton to the Northern cotton mills. They want to sell it to England because England pays a better price. After all that argument, tariffs go down and down and down and down. The government's still collecting a lot of money. There's an argument here. When tariffs are high, you don't have a lot of trade. When tariffs are low, you collect less money on each thing, but you should have a lot more things to tax. So the question is always, where does the tariff belong? So during the Civil War, tariffs go up to help pay for the Civil War. By the time we get to the 1880s and 1890s, there's a big fight because the government's collecting a lot of money. In fact, the government's actually collecting more money than it needs. And there's an argument about how should we go about lessening the money, giving money back to the taxpayer. The Republicans want to raise tariffs. The Republicans are in favor of raising taxes and shutting off international trade, and that will keep the government from collecting so much money. The Democrats are in favor of lowering tariffs, which will expand international trade, but because we're charging a lower tax, we'll collect less money. And you can see that again, part of the progressive movement is lower tariffs. All this stuff, it's amazing how much of America gets tied into this progressive movement and how much similarities we have between what's going on now and what happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So again, big fight between the Republicans and Democrats. Republicans running on, we need high tariffs, and Democrats running on, we need free trade. Late 1800s and now, same thing. So tariffs go down. As the economy slows down, as we head toward the Great Depression, we raise tariffs way up. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff, 1930, doesn't work. The government tries to balance out the Great Depression, tries to stop imports so that U.S. businesses will benefit. It doesn't work because there's retaliation by other countries. There's a trade war. Things work out badly for everybody. Then Roosevelt, when he's president, again, Democrat, progressive, lowers tariffs. At the end of World War II, we get this general agreement on tariffs and trade. And under GATT, we significantly lowered tariffs. Then when President Kennedy is president, we negotiate another version of GATT, which lowers tariffs even further. And then there's another negotiation that lowers tariffs even further. And then this general agreement on tariffs and trade is transformed into the World Trade Organization. So it's still around, still exists, but it's created much lower tariffs. And you saw those numbers on the other side, where in the 1800s, tariffs around the world were 30, 40, 50%. And now tariffs around the world are 1%, 5%, 10%. Okay? So this GATT has, and now the World Trade Organization, has substantially lowered tariffs across the entirety of the planet Earth. So again, we have these international organizations. The IMF is there to bail out countries that get into financial trouble. The World Bank is to help less developed countries create infrastructure so that they can improve their economies. And this World Trade Organization that used to be the GATT is there to help to promote free trade across the world. Okay? And we're not only part of all these, but they're the IMF and the World Bank, right in the middle of Washington, D.C., really easy to go find. World Bank has a better bookstore than the IMF has. Fun places to go. WTO. We need to talk about that. So, is China bad?